All right, how's it going, everyone? So I want to have a little talk about why I pretty much always use React Query. It's also called TanStack Query. I think they renamed it after they started adding support for like other front-end frameworks. But this is like my go-to thing when I use a React application or when I build a React application. Mainly because there's a lot of things that you're going to have to implement anyway in your application. And just using something like React Query just gives you that additional like features that you're going to need anyway. So I want to show you some of those features and kind of explain why I always just use React Query when I build out a React UI. Getting React Query set up is actually pretty straightforward. You basically just import these two things. You'll wrap whatever component that you want with this query client provider. And then inside of your actual component, you can just grab the query client and you can start using use queries and use mutations. Now, this isn't a tutorial where I'm going to show you how to use React Query. I'm going to show you some features as to why I think you might as well just use this, right? So this application, we have a simple to-do list application where when you first load the page, it shows a loading ... div. And then when the data is done fetching from the backend, it displays the data, right? So let's just go ahead and open up the network tab because I think it's good to visualize what's going on here. So when I refresh the page, you'll notice that it will make a request to a to-dos endpoint. And this takes about half a second because I added some fake delays. So during that half a second, in your React applications, you typically want some type of loading or spinner state while your data is being fetched, especially if you're building like a client-side rendered application, like a single page application. You don't want just empty div sitting there. You want either a placeholder, you want some type of loading. And with that necessity, using something like React Query out of the box gives you the ability to do, query.isFetching or query.isLoading. Okay, so you have this built-in way to just, let me switch that back. You have these built-in ways to basically do a query against an endpoint and know if your data is being refreshed or fetched or something like that. So this is how it works here. I basically, let me show you real quick. If you're not familiar with the React Query, you have this method called useQuery, and you pass it an array that kind of builds up a composite key. So if anything inside this key changes, it's going to rerun this callback function here. So for example, if you wanted to fetch a particular to-do using an ID, like if I were to pass this 5, and I wanted to use that 5 somewhere here, I could basically do something like this. This is kind of like pseudocode, to be honest. But I believe you could do something like this and like get the ID. Or the ID might be like in state or something, but hopefully you get the idea. It's just pseudocode. I'm not showing you an actual syntax. But basically, if anything in this thing changes, and sometimes this could be pulled in from state. This 5 could be in a state variable. This 5 could be in props. But when it changes, it reruns this fetch command and does your logic. Now, the benefit of this is out of the box, React Query is going to cache your request. So if you make a request to a /API/todos, it's actually going to take the results and it's going to store them in memory in your browser so that if you ever need to fetch this again, it just grabs it straight from the cache. So that reduces the need to refetch all of the time. And if you can imagine, you have a page with multiple routes and you have users who are quickly going from one route to the next and back. Like let's say I click on a button and then I click back in my browser. You don't want to refetch all that data again. It's already there. You already know what it is. And it's probably going to be the same, like the data probably isn't stale because you haven't done anything, right? So if you click the back button in your browser, it makes sense to just fetch data from the cache. And then behind the scenes, React Query is going to make a request and then refresh your data, right? So it kind of does a background process refresh, which is pretty useful, right? So you make a query, you make a cache key, which is the composite key. You tell it what query to run when this cache key changes to get some data. Behind the scenes, React Query is going to cache that. And then you also have a bunch of options you can pass. So one thing that's really interesting is this refetch on window focus. So out of the box, this is turned on, I believe, but the benefit to this is when I go away from that page and come back, React Query automatically fetches the latest information. And this is kind of useful whenever you have users who are maybe using their application and then they have like multiple tabs open for the same application. And maybe they want to open up a new tab, add some data in, modify some state. And then when they go back to the original tab, you want it to just like refresh that data sometimes, right? So out of the box, React Query does that. You can turn it off if you don't like it. Sometimes you don't want it. Sometimes it just does a bunch of extra stuff that you don't care about. But my point is there's like tons of extra like ways to have React Query refetch on an interval, refetch when the component mounts, refetch on reconnect. Like you can read the docs and just like see that has a ton of extra features that you can use when you need to cache this data from your server state. Now I want to say React Query doesn't replace fetch. It doesn't replace Axios. All React Query is basically a way to do some type of data retrieval. Whether this is from an API or this is from local storage or session storage, it doesn't matter. It's an abstraction, right? So you just do something and React Query is going to cache that with your composite key. In our case, we are using fetch, so we do actually hit a backend endpoint to get to the to-dos. And when it's fetching that data, it's going to set that is loading Boolean here, like I talked about, to true. So that's why when I first load the page, is loading or is fetching will be true. It shows loading, and then it actually shows the results when they come in here. So that's just kind of one benefit. Now I want to show you some more stuff. There's also a use mutation function call you can use, and that's for basically doing post requests to your API or modifying your server state. In our case, we can say use mutation, we get back a create to do mutation object. And similar to the other object, we have the ability to check if it's currently loading. So let me show you this. If I click add another, notice that I disabled the button. This is something that you're going to need in your application anyway. When you click on a button, you don't want a user to double submit or triple submit a request. You want to disable the button to prevent them from keep on adding data in. Okay, so out of the box, you have this way to know if a mutation is currently in progress or if it's done. And when it is in progress, you can just disable the button. So that alone is enough to just like want to use React Query, right? It provides you the is loading stuff. It provides you a good way to cache and retrieve from your local cache. But there's also a lot of other features as well, which I think are really useful if you want to take it to the next level. One of them is when you actually do your mutation, you can basically tell React Query to refetch the data, right? So in our case, let's just go ahead and click on this. And notice when I do the post request, it does a post to the to-dos, but then right after it does another GET request to get the latest, greatest state of your to-do items, right? So the way we do that is we basically just invalidate this cache, which was the same cache key that we set up here. So whenever you do query client invalidate queries, and you kind of invalidate that original cache, React Query is just going to refetch the data for you, right? You don't have to worry about doing that like a manually imperative process. It's a reactive way. It just kind of runs an effect and it refetches the data, which is pretty cool. Now, let's say you don't want to refetch all the to-dos, right? Like that could be it could take a lot of time to go to the back and get all the to-dos again and replace your state. So you can also just append the new to-do item that you get back from the back end directly into your React Query data, right? So behind the scene, React Query has just an internal React state variable somewhere. And I'm just basically updating that array of to-dos with the new to-do that was created from the backend. So instead of invalidating the query and making the front end do a complete API request, we're just going to push that directly into the array. And now when I click on this, notice that it doesn't do another fetch for the to-dos, but we can see it displayed here, right? So that just reduces the bandwidth and kind of reduces the need to like keep on refetching the queries if you want to. It's up to you. But that's just one cool feature that's built out of the box. Like I'm just showing that everything that React Query stores for your cache, like you can modify it manually if you need to. So it kind of gives you the flexibility to really make React Query achieve what you need in your application. So another thing I want to show you, this one's pretty cool, but it's a little bit more complicated. There's something called optimistic updates. So when I click on add another, it takes like half a second to hit the backend and then it adds the data. But we know that we can just add the to-do right when we click on this button, right? Typically you have a form that has some inputs. The moment you click submit, you could basically push that to some type of state so that the user doesn't have to wait around. And then if an error happens, you can roll that back, right? So there's something called optimistic updates in React Query that you can use. Let me just go ahead and uncomment all this. So what this is doing is basically the moment you call this mutate method, which is basically the moment I click on that button, it calls create to do mutate, and then it pushes this to-do list pseudo object into the mutate method. So we get that new to-do here. And what we're saying is when we mutate, we're going to invalidate or cancel any of the queries that might be accessing to the backend now. Just cancel those out. And then we get the query data. So get the original state that has the arrays of all the to-do items. And then we're going to push in that new pseudo object that we talked about with the random ID. This is just a hard-coded 555, but you probably want to do like a random generator to make an ID. And what this is doing is this is basically instantly pushing that object into the state so that we don't have to wait around for half a second for that to show up. And then finally, we return the new state like this. Actually, I don't even know what this is. I have to go read the docs. I don't know why we return previous to-dos here. But then if there's an error, what we do is we roll back the to-dos that have the previous to-dos. And then also, if everything is done, we just basically invalidate the queries and it's going to refetch. Okay, so let's see that in action. I'm going to go ahead and just click on add another. And notice that instantly it puts that testing into this array. Now there is a little like race condition that the is loading I probably have to get rid of. So I probably have to go down here and I would have to maybe not do the is fetching stuff. Or there might be a better way to do that. But basically what's happening is we push the new to-do into the array. It does a fetch for the latest version of the to-dos. And I think I could just call this is loading instead of is fetching. Is fetching is going to call every time you refresh the data. So let's try it again. I'll click add another. It basically pushes testing here. And then behind the scenes, it fetches the latest version of the to-dos. And it's going to update this if there's anything that's kind of out of sync. So this is optimistic updating. Notice that it's instant. And if I were to go to the API and go to the backend, let's say for some reason we wanted to throw an error. So I'm going to say res.status of 400. So this, now when I do this, I should get an error back, hopefully. And notice that it deleted that optimistic update. Okay, so it pushed on testing, and after half a second, the backend API failed, and it deleted it from the UI. I put this in the wrong place. I should probably put this here. Let's just go ahead and refresh. Let me do it again. So optimistic update pushes it in, the API fails, and then it's supposed to remove it. Why is it not? Oh, I should probably return here. Sorry, I didn't really prepare for this. Let's try it one more time. So push in testing, API fails, it refetches the latest state of the API, and then it refreshes that list here. So again, you don't have to use optimistic updates. It does add a little bit of complexity to your code, but it does allow your code to be super responsive, and you can just kind of push data into the UI and assume that it's always going to work and the backend won't crash. And if the rare case that the backend did not accept your request, you can always roll back to the previous stuff. So the point of this whole video is, I know a lot of this stuff seems like it's overkill. Like the caching might seem like overkill, but you'll end up needing it if you do like a single page application or you're navigating between pages that share the same state. The is loading stuff is just a nice little thing that you're going to end up having in your applications anyway. So you might as well just use this React query library to handle that. You could just make your own custom hook that like wraps your API request and sets an is loading boolean and sets it to true and false. But I mean, just use a library that already exists. And then the refetch on window focus is actually pretty cool. It basically just makes it so every time you go to your page, it has the latest thing displaying for your users. And there's a lot of other things that are built into React Query, which I haven't even dived into. So my final remarks are, this is a pretty cool library, and this is kind of the reasons that I kind of just use it by default in any of my React UIs, because it gives you so much functionality out of the box. And I just, you know, you're going to need caching at some point if you want to make your application actually be polished and super fast and responsive for your users. Anyway, if you enjoyed watching this, give me a thumbs up, comment, subscribe, press the bell icon, and like always, feel free to join my Discord. There's a link to my Discord in the description of the video where you can ask questions if you're stuck on learning how to code or stuck on learning React, and we can hopefully help you out with any questions you might have. Have a good day. Happy coding.